All right, guys. This set of notes is on the basics of the Renaissance. So, with the increase in trade that we see in the latter half of the medieval period, particularly post-contact during the Crusades, the Italians in particular, because of their proximity to the Middle East, their location on the Mediterranean Sea, that sort of thing, are actually going to become significantly more wealthy than they were in the past. And those wealthy merchants are going to become active in their communities and in their governments and in the cultural centers of their towns. In the Renaissance, the definition of Renaissance is that there is a rebirth, the definition of Renaissance, rebirth in learning, largely in classical learning in the Greeks and the Romans. And it's going to produce a lot of just, globally recognized masterpieces of art and of literature. So, city-states in Italy, particularly Florence and Venice and Genoa, are all going to have this increased access to trade. They're going to have access to the city of Rome. They're going to have access to Constantinople, things coming out of Damascus, things coming out of Cairo and Egypt, all that sort of thing. And those cities then become sort of like distribution centers for the trade coming in and out of Europe, because merchants from England and France and Spain and Portugal are going to stop in Italy because of geographically where it's located. And so they're going to become sort of the access point for everyone in Europe and in the Middle East. Initially, all of these city-states are going to be governed independently, similar to how ancient Greece was governed, where Athens and Sparta and all the others were all independent cities. They're actually going to have republics. They're going to have representative, that's what this word is supposed to say right here, is representative governments like the Romans. So Italy in the Renaissance is a combination of Greek city-states as well as Roman republic systems. So it's a little bit of a juxtaposition of two of our major cultures, but that's why it's such a rebirth of the Greco-Roman culture. And also why artists and scholars are going to study things like the ruins of the buildings of Rome. I mean, they have the Colosseum and they have the fountains and they have the aqueducts. But they also have all of the literature that the Byzantines and the Islamic empires and the monasteries have been preserving for the last, say, 1,000 years. So they have all this rich, deep history in this literature. When Constantinople is going to fall to the Ottoman Turks in the 1400s, 1500s, a lot of the Christians that were living in Constantinople are going to move out of Constantinople because they don't want to live under the Ottoman Muslim rule, mostly because they had to pay taxes for being Christians. And they move back into Italy, and so they bring that information and that culture with them as well. The big overarching intellectual theme of the day is humanism. Humanism focuses on the individual. It focuses on human value. It focuses on human achievement. It focuses on the writing and the literature and the philosophy and the science and the math. And it's a huge shift away from the church. Because remember, for the medieval period, if you were studying in any version of, upper education, you were studying the church. You were going to be a priest or something. You were studying ecclesiastical things. But instead, we're going to shift to, the other subjects of the world. Largely, especially hearkening back to what was happening in Greece and Rome. And they're going to be supported, just like the artists are, they're going to be supported by wealthy patrons. Patrons are people who pay, say the pay and patron, people who pay for artists. They support the artists, they support the writers, that sort of thing. So, for instance, when you commission a person to paint this mural on a wall, right, you are their patron, you are the one helping support them. And the wealthiest, most famous is the Medici family. They are a very wealthy family in Italy who had a lot of ties economically and politically throughout the Renaissance period. So that's all that I just said. Sorry. But the church also could be a patron, so that's one thing to keep in mind, is that a lot of churches are commissioning things. For instance, one of the paintings that you need to know is that Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So it's this entire scenes from the Bible across the ceiling of this church, and that was the Roman Catholic Church paying him to paint those. So it's not specifically secular or specifically religious. It's a blending of both. The other term is Renaissance man that we need to know. A Renaissance man is a person who excelled in lots of fields. Leonardo da Vinci being sort of the epitome of that, where you are you're not just an artist. You don't just paint. You also sculpt, but you also write, but you also study science. I mean, Da Vinci is an inventor. He puts together things to make a helicopter, even. So there's lots of skills. It's like a jack of all trades. That's what a Renaissance man is. Women exist throughout history. We don't generally talk about them, but obviously 50% of the population is there. Upper class women are educated, and again, they're going to be educated, obviously in some of the basic tenets of Christianity, but it's more so they're going to be educated in poetry and literature and things like that. They're not going to be studying history so much because that's not a ladylike field, ironically, right? You're not supposed to be studying like battles and strategy and that sort of thing. It's the lighter, fluffier things. They also were not expected to be artists. They weren't expected to be creating. They're not painting or anything like that. They're just meant to be inspirational muses to the artists of the world. Writers started writing in the language they spoke, which is revolutionary. Like, we speak English, let's read in English instead of Latin. And so some fairly famous works from the period. Paradise Lost is it says it's a poem. It is poetry, but it is a novel of poetry, really. Is about the fall of Adam and Eve. Of course, you have William Shakespeare here in the middle. He is a playwright. He writes Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet and Macbeth and A Midsummer Night's Dream. But he also writes sonnets and essays and just all kinds of things. And then this other one is Machiavelli's The Prince. Niccolo Machiavelli is on our next slide. There he is. Wrote about the government. He wrote basically like a guidebook for people who are going to become leaders of the government, largely royal leaders of the government. And he maintains the concept that a king has a responsibility to his people, to his citizens, to do what is necessary, regardless of whether what is necessary is morally correct. So, for example, he would be in full support of, say, assassinating a political opponent in order to maintain your power. He's in full support of backing out on a treaty if it's no longer economically advantageous, that sort of thing. He's also perfectly happy lying, so long as that's maintaining the level you need to maintain. Erasmus writes a book called In Praise of Folly. It's a satirical work. It's a work that mocks the culture of today, of his time. And he's a Christian humanist, so it's actually a little bit of a juxtaposition talking about the power that priests have and the power that merchants have over the rest of society, which is, very anti the biblical sort of concepts. Sir Thomas More writes a book called Utopia. Utopia means perfect society, so Sir Thomas More is part of the Northern Renaissance. He writes a book about what an ideal society would look like. Incidentally, if you've ever seen the movie Ever After, which is one of the Cinderella adaptations, came out in maybe the late 90s. In Ever After, that's the book that she was reading with her father because it sets in the same time period. The Northern Renaissance is just where the Renaissance spreads from Italy north, so to France and to the Holy Roman Empire and to England. After the 100 Years' War between France and England, those countries obviously start to rebuild and obviously start to grow. And those merchants, based on that trade, become wealthy and support the arts just like the Italians do. England and France both have strong monarchs that support the arts, so they have this push towards the same kind of ideals that the Renaissance has. The key difference that a lot of people can see between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, ironically considering the location of the Catholic Church, is that the Northern Renaissance artists are actually much more devoted to their faith. They're much more devoted to portraying God in their art than the Italian Renaissance artists were. The Italian Renaissance artists, of course, portray God, but only when they needed to, not as a rule. And there are entire Renaissance artists of the Northern Renaissance period who only ever do religious works. So we've talked about this before, but in the 11th century, China created a printing press. And then we actually talk about how in Europe it's invented 400 years later. And so, unfortunately for the Chinese and Bicheng, you have to know that Gutenberg invents this thing, which he doesn't technically. I guess he pioneers it in Europe, but it had been happening in other parts of the world. But obviously the deal with the printing press is that you can mass produce things. So the first mass production he does is on the Bible. And imagine the time saver between handwriting the Bible and making printed copies of it. So it's going to allow for literacy to grow because more people can have access to books. It's also going to allow for ideas to spread and that sort of thing. So it's the meat of why the Renaissance catches on everywhere and why the writings are shared and why the things become so synonymous with European culture, is because everyone in Europe could read the same text. All you would have to do is translate it and reprint it. So it's a massive innovation for the Europeans, even though the Chinese have been doing it for 400 years. All right. As with everything, if you have any questions, let me know. Make sure that you're getting your stuff down in your packet and answered all your questions. Bye, guys.